My name is Clara Mitchell. I am 62 years old, a retired cafeteria worker who spent decades cooking meals for other people's children while packing cold sandwiches for my own. I never thought my story would matter to anyone outside the walls of my tiny apartment, but everything changed the night I stood in front of my daughter's house, clutching an old canvas bag that carried nothing but a faded family photo and a hand-stitched handkerchief from years ago. My life had already shifted in ways no one could imagine, but no one knew the truth. Because just a week before that night, I had won the lottery, $20 million. A number so large that my hands shook when I checked the ticket. A number that could have changed everything. Yet instead of announcing it, instead of calling my family with the news, I did something unthinkable. I pretended I had lost everything. I wanted to see who would still open their door to me when I had nothing left to give. So there I was, late at night, standing on the front porch of my daughter Emily's suburban home. The house glowed with warm light behind the windows. I could hear the muffled laughter of my grandchildren inside. My heart pounded with a mixture of fear and hope. This was not about money. This was about love, loyalty, and whether my daughter would see me as her mother or as a burden she wished away. When Emily opened the door, her face registered surprise, not joy. She looked at me the way one might look at an unexpected guest at the wrong hour. "Mom, what are you doing here so late?" she asked. I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced my voice to tremble just enough to sound believable. "Emily, I lost my part-time job. I am behind on rent. I need a place to stay, just for a little while." She shifted uncomfortably, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid her husband might hear. I saw her eyes dart to the bag in my hand, worn and fraying, the same bag I had carried to work for years. Her voice lowered. "Mom, we don't really have space. The kids are using every room. Maybe you could try a shelter. They help people in situations like this." The words struck me harder than any physical blow ever could. A shelter. After raising her, after sacrificing every dream of my own, my daughter's solution was to send me to a place for strangers. Just then, my granddaughter darted into the hallway, her little arms wrapping around my legs. "Grandma, stay with us," she said brightly, her innocence shining through the cold air. For a moment, hope flickered, but Emily quickly pulled the child back inside, her face tight with unease. Then, without another word, she closed the door. I stood there on the porch, the winter air cutting through my coat, my breath visible in the dark. My fingers clutched the bag tighter. In my chest, something cracked open. It was not anger. It was not even grief. It was clarity. I had won $20 million. But that night, standing outside my own daughter's home, I pretended I had nothing. And when I asked for help, she told me to try a shelter, then closed the door in my face. The next morning, my lawyer made a single phone call, a call that would travel across phone lines like a quiet storm, a call that made my daughter scream so loud the neighbors heard. Meanwhile, I sat in my apartment, poured hot water into a chipped mug and stirred my tea. The steam rose slowly as I whispered to myself, "Now I know the truth." That was the moment my life split in two. The life before my daughter shut the door and the life after. One choice changed everything. If you are still listening, stay with me. This story is not about the lottery, not about money, not even about revenge. It is about what happens when sacrifice meets silence, when love is tested by indifference, and when a woman who has been overlooked finally chooses to see her own worth. If you have ever wondered who would open the door for you when you have nothing left, I invite you to walk beside me in this journey. My name is Clara Mitchell. I am 62 years old, a widow, and I live in a small third-floor apartment. I worked most of my life in a public school cafeteria. Before that, I scrubbed office floors at night and sewed hems for neighbors. My hands learned the weight of stock pots and the patience of stitching. My back learned the daily ache that follows you into bed and wakes with you before dawn. The apartment is modest, but every sound has its place. The refrigerator hums, the radiator ticks awake with the cold, the radio murmurs headlines while I brew tea in a chipped mug. The couch came from a thrift store. The blanket draped there was knitted in a hospital waiting room when my husband, Paul, was sick. He died 10 years ago, and I kept the blanket because it remembers what my body would rather forget. I live on lists and rituals that keep walls from pressing in. I walk to the supermarket with a canvas bag and return with apples, oats, and sometimes a jar of honey if it is on sale. On Thursdays, I help set tables for a seniors' lunch at the community center. By coffee time, stories loosen from mouths and drift as music. A plant on my windowsill leans toward the light and teaches me likewise. Emily is my only child. She lives 20 minutes away in a house with children and a calendar that seems to own her. We talk, but more by message than voice. Her texts are brief, her calls are short. When she needs a holiday dish or a babysitter, I appear on her list between errands. I go because love still feels like showing up. Later, I replay voicemails just to hear her call me mom. There are birthdays promised and postponed, dinners arranged and rearranged. Next week becomes next month while calendar turns. A year ago, I fainted in my kitchen and struck my elbow on the stove. I called Emily. She replied she was stuck at work and I should call a taxi to urgent care. I did. I paid fare and sat in fluorescent lights, while a nurse wrapped my arm and said I should not be alone. I keep my history in small drawers. A wedding band rests in a box with a loose hinge. A photograph shows Emily at 9, cheeks flushed with fever, sleeping while I pressed a cool cloth to her forehead. A handkerchief I stitched years ago carries crooked initials. Fabric has softened the way a prayer softens when repeated. I carry cloth in my pocket on days and hold it at the sink while the kettle warms. I am not blind to the distance that grew between us. I taught my daughter competence. I hid my need and said I was fine, so often she believed me. People mean well until life tilts. Then intentions slide to edges and habit takes center. I once believed sacrifice would keep a family together. The truth is, I am left with dinners without voices. On those nights, I eat slowly, giving silence only empty chairs. The neighbors know me by first name. Margaret across the hall bakes bread on Sundays and slips me a slice wrapped in a napkin. We trade weather and recipes like a kind of liturgy. The super asks me to sign for packages because I am home most days. The mail carrier tucks letters under the mat when the slot jams. These steady reliances stitch the hours and give my days strength that looks like grace. I still pick up substitute shifts when the district calls. The hairnet, the steam, metal trays moving down the line. The rhythm returns like a song learned young. Teenagers call me Miss Clara and ask for extra fruit. I give it and smile. I save the stickers from apples and line them on a scrap of paper in the junk drawer. They look like tiny medals for ordinary victories, and victories keep a person steady. At night, I read by the window while buses sigh below and a siren fades toward the river. I make lists I never show anyone. Repairs I might try if the budget stretches, books to request from library, recipes to attempt if company comes. Company rarely comes, yet the list is an act of faith. I turn off the lamp, breathe with building, and sleep not from certainty but from practice, waiting for what arrives. When I close my eyes, I can still smell the machine oil and hear the clatter of gears in the factory where I worked nights. I was younger then, though my bones already ached as if they belonged to an older woman. The hours stretched long, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The conveyor belts demanded fingers that did not tire. My own fingers cracked and bled from stitching heavy fabric, and the tips were stained with dye that soap never fully removed. I remember staring at my hands, red from effort, and thinking how much of myself I was giving away one thread at a time. The whistle at dawn was not relief, but urgency. My shift ended, yet my day as a mother began. I hurried home through the quiet streets, shoes rubbing blisters into my heels. My heart raced faster than my steps because Emily was waiting. She was only 7 then, a small girl with hair that curled against her pillow and a fever that often rose in the night. I would push open our apartment door and hear her soft cough echoing through the stillness. On the table near her bed, I always kept a small handkerchief. It was not store-bought. I had cut fabric from an old dress and stitched her initials crookedly in one corner. It was the first thing I ever made with the sewing machine at work during a rare break. The cloth was rough but softened each time I washed it. When Emily's forehead burned, I would dampen the handkerchief and press it gently against her skin. She would stir, sometimes whisper, "Mom," and I would feel the exhaustion slip away as if my tired body could be replaced with pure devotion. That handkerchief became a kind of companion to us. I carried it in my pocket when I walked to work. I clutched it when bills piled up on the counter. I folded it neatly whenever I wanted to remind myself why the struggle mattered. Each frayed thread was a record of sacrifice. Each faded stitch a vow that my child would have more than I ever did. I did not know then that I was binding more than cloth. I was stitching my hope directly into my heart. There were nights when Emily would wake and cry, frightened by shadows or dreams. I would sit on her bed, humming softly, wiping her cheeks with that little square of fabric. Sometimes she would fall asleep, holding it tight in her hand. I watched her breathe evenly again and thought, one day she will understand. One day she will see what it costs to keep the lights on, to keep soup warm on the stove, to keep her world safe. Years passed, but the handkerchief stayed with me. It moved from one coat pocket to another, tucked away like a secret. When Paul died, I carried it to the funeral and pressed it against my face to catch tears. When Emily married, I held it in my palm as I sat in the back pew, unseen, proud yet afraid of losing my place in her new life. When her children were born, I brought it folded in my purse, as if the memory of our earliest days together could bless the new generation. Even now, in my 60s, I feel for it whenever loneliness presses heavy on my chest. The fabric is thin, the edges unraveling, but it is mine. It is ours. Sometimes when I fold laundry, I smooth it carefully and whisper words into its threads, as if it can still carry messages to the past. I remind myself, you did not work in vain. You did not love in vain. And yet, as I sit here recalling those nights of rushing home with hands bleeding, pressing that damp cloth against a child's fevered skin, I cannot help but wonder what became of all those sacrifices. I never asked for repayment. I never wanted riches. I only wanted to be remembered with tenderness, to be seen as the woman who gave more than she had. But life has a way of turning devotion into expectation. I once believed the handkerchief was a promise between us, that love stitched into fabric could never be forgotten. But the years taught me otherwise. Emily grew, and the cloth became invisible. My sacrifices faded into ordinary background. I carried the proof, but she carried only her busy calendar, her endless lists, her closed doors. I have held that handkerchief through joy and through grief, through hope and through despair. It is a relic of my motherhood, a small square of truth against a lifetime of forgetting. I never imagined the day would come when I would stand at her doorstep, clutching it in my pocket, asking for help, and be told there was no space. I never thought I would hear my own daughter suggest a shelter, as if I were a stranger. I did not know then that every stitch I sewed into that cloth would echo back to me, not as gratitude but as silence. I did not know that the answer to a lifetime of sacrifice could be so cold, so final. I never knew what I would receive in return for those nights of bleeding hands and whispered lullabies, but now I do. The truth arrived not in thanks but in rejection. And that, perhaps, is the harshest lesson of all. The ticket hung on my refrigerator beneath a bent magnet from the community center. After a long shift, I forgot it, until the kettle began to whisper, and the apartment settled into night noises. I opened the site on my phone and read the first number. It matched. I read the second. It matched too. My hands shook. I braced my elbows on the counter and read the third. Match again. Fourth, match. Fifth, match. I felt my heart beat while I waited for the last number. The final number arrived on the screen with blue confidence. It matched. $20 million. The total glowed neat and polite, as if money that large could be gentle. The kettle screamed. I turned off the flame with fingers that felt borrowed, then slid into the chair by the window. A bus exhaled at the corner. A siren thinned down the avenue. I pressed my palm to my mouth. A laugh rose and turned to a sob, and tears ran along the lines time had carved. I checked everything again. The date, the draw, the small print that says void if damaged. I smoothed the ticket as though it were a wrinkled shirt and held it to the light. I tried to sip my tea but could not taste. Numbers have governed my days, portions in the cafeteria, dollars in a purse, minutes left on a break. Now numbers were rewriting the script. I felt rich and exposed, as if someone had opened my door and waited in the hall that night. I could have called someone. That is what people do in movies. They shout, they dance in kitchens, they pop corks and shake confetti from the air. I did none of that. I opened a search bar with shaking hands and typed a question. What should a lottery winner do? The answers read like warnings. A brother financed cousins and ended broke. A woman told her sister and landed in a lawsuit. Marriages cracked. Friendships soured. Children learned to bargain with birthdays and stopped saying, please. I read until the tea went cool, and the chill moved through my sleeves. Article after article wore the same. Moral in different clothes. Money does not change who people are. It only raises the volume. The sentence sat across from me like an uninvited guest. I thought of Emily and the way calendar swallowed weekends. I thought of the night I fainted and she told me to call a taxi. I love my daughter. I will. But love does not guarantee shelter when storm arrives. I whispered to the kitchen the question I did not wish to say aloud. If my daughter knows, will I still be a mother or just a wallet? The words scratched my throat on their way out. I pictured her porch light shining on my face while I clutched the canvas bag I carry for groceries. I pictured her husband counting rooms. I pictured a smile that means no. I pressed the ticket under my palm and felt my pulse beat through paper like a hammer. I took the handkerchief from my pocket and wrapped the ticket inside it like a relic. Fabric met paper. Memory met chance. I placed the bundle in the cookie tin where I keep buttons and a tape measure, then washed my face and set the kettle. I needed counsel, not celebration. On the community board there was a card for a lawyer who handled wills. I saved his number and left it unused. Night fell. I set the card beside the tin and waited for morning. At 9, the next morning, I called. His name was Harold Benton. His voice was steady, and he asked me to come after hours so there would be no waiting room chatter. I rode the bus with the ticket in my purse and the handkerchief folded over it like a vow. In his office, blinds sliced the light into bands. He examined the ticket without spectacle and asked what I wanted. Safety, privacy, dignity. He explained blind trusts, taxes, and investments that favor patience over appetite. By dusk, we had a plan. The trust would claim the prize. My name would remain off headlines. The funds would flow into conservative accounts and a checking balance for daily needs. I would tell no one. Silence would be my shield while I decided who I was when time no longer bossed me. I left his office to a city glowing as if nothing had changed. Home, I set water to boil and breathed. I did not celebrate. I chose secrecy and I chose resolve for the days and choices ahead. The plan Harold and I agreed upon gave me cover, but it did not soften the old ache living in the corners of my kitchen. I set the kettle and watched steam climb like a thin flag. The apartment seemed to hold its breath. In the quiet, a memory stepped forward with the persistence of a bruise. It was late last winter, the hour when fatigue and grief share the same coat. I was scrubbing a stock pot when the room tilted. My knees buckled. I slid to the linoleum and felt the stove recede like a shoreline, slipping under fog. I crawled to a chair and sat shivering even though the radiator hissed. My elbow throbbed where bone had struck metal. I reached for my phone with hands that felt borrowed and pressed Emily's name. It rang, then dropped to voicemail. I called again and left, a message that sounded smaller than I felt. I said I was dizzy and hurt and frightened to stand. I waited with the phone in my palm like a lifeline. Minutes passed, slow and heavy. The screen lit with a text. "Mom, call a taxi, I'm busy." I stared until the letters lost their shape. I read them again because part of me believed I had misunderstood. There was nothing vulgar in the sentence. There was only a tidy refusal, a neat dismissal that fit inside a single line. I called a cab and waited by the door with my coat across my shoulders. The driver helped me down the steps and asked if I had family. I said yes, which was true, and I said no, which felt truer. At urgent care, a nurse cleaned the scrape and wrapped the elbow. She asked whether someone could stay with me that night. I told her my daughter was busy and that I would be fine. I carried that night home, like a fragile plate. The next morning, I cooked oatmeal, turned the radio low, and tried to let routine reseal the crack. Emily called in the evening. Her voice was full of the static of busyness, bedtime, dishes, deadlines. She apologized and told me the meeting had run late and the freeway had been a parking lot. I told her I understood and that I was fine. I chose those words because understanding had become the only way to stay inside love. Now, months later, I stand in the same kitchen and the light feels older. The refrigerator hums, the clock ticks, the handkerchief rests in my pocket with the weight of a small stone. I look around at proofs of a life built without witnesses. The dent in the table where Paul dropped a hammer during a repair that never quite held. The mug with a chip shaped like a crescent. These objects keep better company than phone calls that end before the kettle boils. I run water over my hands and consider the silence between my daughter and me. Silence is not empty. It is crowded with the things we decline to say. I taught Emily to be self-sufficient, to push through, to handle her own business, to expect little help. I also taught her that I was fine, always fine. Fine even when the floor rose to meet me. She learned the lesson well. She believed the mask because I wore it like a second skin. I press both palms to the counter and feel the grain of wood through the thin pad of my skin. I say out loud what I have only whispered. I will test them. I will see whether love can cross a threshold without being invited by advantage. I will go to that door with nothing but my name and a canvas bag. I will ask for help and learn who I am to them when numbers and noise fall away. The words do not taste like vengeance. They taste like clarity. I dry my hands and fold the dish towel in half. The apartment watches as if it knows a ceremony has begun. I put away the kettle, straighten the blanket on the couch, and set the cookie tin back on the shelf. Outside, a bus exhales at the corner and pulls away. I whisper to the room the steady promise that will steer me through. What comes next? I will try them, and if I find no welcome, I will try myself. If I must build a shelter, it will be made of my two hands and the truth they have earned. The night I chose to test my daughter was colder than it should have been for spring. The air carried that raw edge that makes you pull your collar higher, even when the calendar insists warmth is near. I stood on Emily's porch with a canvas bag tugging at my shoulder. My knuckles rested against the wood of the door, hesitating for one breath, then another. I whispered my own name, as if reminding myself who I was, then lifted my hand and knocked. The sound was timid at first, a hollow tap, then firmer. 3 times that echoed into the quiet suburban street. The door opened slowly, spilling a triangle of light across my shoes. Emily stood there, her hair gathered in a neat bun, her sweater draped like armor. Surprise flickered across her face, then rearranged into polite tension. "Mom," she said, her voice neither warm nor cold, simply factual like a weather report. I felt the tremor in my throat as I searched for words. My hand tightened on the strap of the bag. "Emily," I began, I lost my job, and the landlord, he says I may lose the apartment too." My voice shook like a paper held too close to fire. Her eyes darted past me toward the driveway, as if checking whether neighbors might see this fragile scene. She shifted her weight, pulling the door a little closer to her frame. That's a lot," she murmured. Silence pooled between us, thick and waiting. I filled it because silence has always made me confess. "I don't know where else to go tonight," I whispered. "I thought, maybe, I could stay here for a while, just until I figure things out." Emily pressed her lips together. Her eyes softened for a fraction of a second, the way clouds part to hint at sun, then closed again. She inhaled, long and measured, before speaking. "Mom, we don't really have space. The house is small and work has been overwhelming." She paused, and her voice lowered into that rational register people use when delivering bad news as gently as possible. "Maybe you should try a shelter. They help seniors. They have programs. It might be better equipped than we are." Her words landed not like blows, but like a door clicking shut from the inside. I blinked, trying to understand if I had misheard. "A shelter," I repeated, my mouth tasting of metal. The bag strap bit into my shoulder. "Yes," she nodded quickly. "They're supportive. They know what to do. You'd probably be safer there." Just then, a smaller voice pierced the grown-up conversation. "Grandma?" My granddaughter Lily stood in the hallway clutching a stuffed bear, her eyes wide like lanterns. She tugged my hand with both of hers. "Grandma, stay with us." The plea rang brighter than anything else in that house. For a moment I saw the little girl Emily once was. Knees, scraped, reaching for me in the dark after a nightmare. My heart surged toward the child in front of me, and I crouched to hold her close. But Emily's hand moved quickly. She touched Lily's shoulder, firm but not unkind. "Come on, honey, it's late." Lily resisted, her tiny fingers still looped through mine. Emily pulled gently but steadily until Lily's grip slipped away. I felt each finger release as if it were a stitch, unraveling from the fabric of my chest. Emily gave me a look that was meant to be final, something between apology and boundary. "I'll call you tomorrow, Mom. We'll talk more then." And before I could answer, she guided Lily inside and swung the door. The latch clicked, a small mechanical sound, but it thundered through me louder than any storm. I stood on the porch, staring at the smooth surface of the wood, the porch light buzzing faintly above. My knees trembled, and I steadied myself against the railing. The night air crept deeper into my bones. Inside, muffled voices continued, then faded. The street was empty. The world had folded inward, leaving me outside. I pressed my palm against the closed door, not to knock, not to beg, just to feel the barrier. The grain of the wood was cool and indifferent. My breath came shallow, each exhale a surrender. I turned away slowly, the canvas bag heavy as stone against my back. My shoes tapped down the steps into the dark. In that moment, I did not rage. I did not shout or accuse. I only listened to the silence, to the hollow in my chest, to the faint echo of Lily's voice calling for me. Then, with every step down that quiet street, I heard something else, too. The unmistakable crack of my own heart, splitting open in the night. And I thought, as clearly as a prayer, the door closed, and I heard my heart shatter. I set my canvas bag on the table and switched on a lamp. The apartment felt like a chapel after a funeral, the air respectful, the silence stubborn. I slid a faded family photo from the bag and set it by a chipped mug. Paul's crooked smile faced 7-year-old Emily. I looked younger than memory, Beside the photo, I laid the handkerchief I stitched from an old dress on a late shift, its thread uneven and corners soft. I rested both hands over the two objects as if blessing them. Heat rose from the mug and fogged the glass. The picture blurred and cleared with each breath. Rooms like mine turn honest when they hear a voice, so I spoke aloud. I told Paul about the porch. I repeated Emily's words and tried to soften them. The echo stayed sharp. She told me to try a shelter. I said I was tired. I said I was not broken. The stove clock clicked. I traced the frayed hem of the handkerchief, feeling each knot. My mind leaned toward anger. My chest refused. Anger is easy. Dignity is work. I asked the question I have carried since that night. Should I cut my daughter from my life? The words arrived without punctuation. They felt like falling. If I cut her away, what do I teach my grandchildren? If I keep the door open, what do I teach myself about worth? I stood to rinse the mug. Water hissed and crowded the room. I shut the tap and leaned on the sink. I taught Emily to finish what she started, to choose the brave part, to honor the lines that matter. I held lines for decades. I held her forehead through fevers. I held 3 jobs when 2 were not enough. The line I never held was the one around my value. Tonight I could draw it with a steady hand. I carried the photo to the window and let streetlight lay a ribbon across the glass. When Emily was small, she asked why the moon followed us home. I told her the moon was a faithful friend for lonely windows. I looked at the moon and asked what love owes itself when love is met by closed doors. The answer did not come. The silence steadied me and taught me to listen. Clouds drifted above the roofs like tired ships. Back at the table, I opened a drawer of saved papers. One envelope held a poem Lily wrote in crayon. Another held the discharge summary from the night I fell. I spread them beside the photo and studied the table like a clerk reading a ledger. Tenderness lined one margin, neglect the other. I weighed them like peaches. Both were real, both had mass. Only one could feed me when the wind pushed hard. The kettle clicked and I set it on the flame. Money is loud and drags motives forward. If Emily learns about the winnings, will she hear me as a mother or as a bank? I pressed the handkerchief to my heart. The square cooled the heat in my chest. I am not a bank. I am a woman who gives. I will give again, but not to buy permission to be loved or to rent a place at my table. Steam lifted. The tea smelled like a field from my girlhood. I spoke to the table as if it were a witness. I said I would not punish Emily. Punishment is for children who can still be taught. I would set a boundary instead. Boundaries are for adults who intend to remain whole. She chose at her door. I would choose at my table. The choices would pass like trains on separate tracks. Each would carry passengers. I took out my phone and watched the screen light the lines in my hand. The plan Harold and I drafted waited like a ship in harbor, quiet and patient. It protected dignity and left room for grace if hearts changed. I placed the photo in the bag and folded the handkerchief over it. Memory deserves care when a life turns. The harbor would wait until I chose weather. I tapped Harold's number. He answered with the calm that had steadied me once before and asked whether I wished to proceed. My breath slowed. I looked at the picture under the lamp and felt years lift and settle like snow on a quiet street. I did not tremble. My voice surprised me. It sounded clear and merciful. I said with the calm that arrives when a person finally honors her own line, "It is time to execute the plan." Morning light crept across my apartment floor like a pale hand reaching under the curtains. I was, still in my robe, the photo of Paul and Emily propped on the table, when Harold called to confirm he had made the scheduled outreach. His voice was steady. Mine was quiet. I thanked him, poured hot water into a chipped teacup, and waited. If the plan held, the weight of truth would arrive not through my lips, but through his. Harold told me he had spoken to Emily. His tone remained professional, but I could hear an edge beneath it, the faint ripple of discomfort when delivering a message that cuts. He explained to her that I had come into a sum of $20 million, that I had instructed him to establish a trust for my grandchildren, and that her name had been formally excluded. He said she went silent for a beat, then her voice rose so sharp he had to hold the receiver away. I could picture her hand gripping the kitchen counter, knuckles white, disbelief clashing with entitlement. Though I was not present in her home, sound travels in stories, and Harold painted enough of the scene for me to hear it. Emily screamed, not a cry of pain, but the kind of scream a person gives when the ground shifts beneath their feet. The sound was so fierce, Harold assured me the neighbors would have no trouble recognizing it. That scream, once mine during childbirth, now echoed down her street for an entirely different birth. An awakening that money could not buy love, nor secure legacy when trust was fractured. I sipped my tea and listened to the silence that followed Harold's account. Steam curled around my face, and for the first time in months I felt my breath steady. My hand reached for the handkerchief beside the cup, pressing it against my palm like a verdict. I did not rejoice. There was no triumph in punishing my own blood, but there was clarity. And clarity has its own flavor, subtle and strong, like bitter chocolate that lingers on the tongue. From what Harold relayed, Emily's voice cracked after the scream. She demanded to know if it was reversible, if he had misunderstood, if there had been some mistake. Harold assured her there was none. He told her the documents had already been signed and filed, that her mother had been deliberate. Her desperation spilled into fragmented words, half plea, half fury. The conversation ended with a slammed phone, and Harold, professional as always, wished her peace before the line went dead. I imagined the walls of her house holding the sound of her anguish, vibrating with disbelief. I imagined Lily covering her ears or hiding behind the couch, wondering why her mother was suddenly louder than any storm. The neighbors, curious and concerned, likely peeked through blinds or paused in their gardens. Emily's scream, once private, had become public, a bell tolling across fences and lawns. Her grief was no longer mine to contain. I returned my cup to its saucer and watched the liquid settle. My mind wandered back to the porch the night before, the finality of the door closing in my face. I remembered the silence that had wrapped itself around me like a shroud. Now the silence was hers. The exchange was complete. I had given her one chance, and she had given me her answer. The law had given her mine. Harold promised to stop by later with documents for my review, but I hardly heard him. My attention shifted toward the distant hum of tires. I imagined Emily pacing her kitchen, then grabbing her keys with trembling hands. The anger would be her compass, pointing her toward me. The steering wheel would hold the weight of her fury, and the road between us would shrink beneath her desperate drive. I looked at the handkerchief again, folded neatly by the photo. The fabric had survived sweat, blood, tears, years of washing, years of mending. It was a witness to endurance. Tonight it would witness confrontation. My breath slowed as I whispered to the room, "She is coming." The words carried no fear, only acknowledgement. The wheel was already turning, and I would not stop it. I sat straighter in my chair and poured another cup of tea. Steam rose once more, carrying with it the scent of jasmine and the quiet promise of resilience. Outside, a bird sang as if nothing in the world had shifted, but I knew better. Somewhere on the road between her house and mine, Emily was driving hard, her scream still clinging to her throat, her future colliding with my decision. And in that waiting, in that fragile calm, I felt both sorrow and strength braid themselves into one. The cliff did not frighten me. I had already learned to stand at the edge without falling. Now I would watch my daughter arrive, her heart crashing against the truth she never expected. The knock on my door was not a polite tap, but a frantic pounding, as if the wood itself might splinter under her fists. I rose slowly, my knees stiff, my hands wrapped around the handle of my teacup. When I opened the door, Emily all but collapsed into the entryway. Her mascara was smeared, her breath ragged. The scream Harold had heard had drained into sobs that shook her body from the inside out. "Mom," she cried, her voice breaking into pieces. "Mom, I didn't mean it. Please don't leave me out. I didn't know. I was wrong. Please, please don't do this to me." Her hands reached for mine, trembling as though I were her last anchor. I felt her fingers clutch, desperate nails pressing into the thin skin across my knuckles. Once, when she was a little girl with scraped knees, she had clung to me the same way. That memory rushed forward now, but it no longer softened the moment. Instead, it revealed the gulf between then and now. Tears spilled from her eyes, streaking down her cheeks, and she shook her head violently. "I'll change. I swear I'll change. Don't cut me off. Don't erase me from your life. I'm your daughter. I'm still your daughter." I guided her gently to a chair, though her sobs made her nearly collapse onto the seat. My own hands shook, but I steadied them by reaching for the pocket of my cardigan. Inside was the folded handkerchief, worn thin by time, corners frayed, embroidery dulled but still visible. The anchor of my years. I held it in my palm, warm from my body heat, and looked at her with a quietness that startled even me. "This," I said softly, placing the cloth into her trembling hand, "is the only inheritance I have for you." She blinked, uncomprehending, then stared down at the fabric. Her fingers traced the tiny stitches of her initials I had sewn decades ago. The sobs deepened, breaking into a low moan. "Mom, please, no, you can't mean this. I don't care about money. I just need you to forgive me. Please, I'll make it right. I'll prove myself. Just give me another chance." I shook my head slowly, the weight of every year pressing against my spine. "Emily, that cloth carries the nights I came home with blistered hands and still found the strength to hold you. It carries sweat, tears, blood, and love that you will never measure in dollars. I once believed love was enough to hold us together, but last night, when you closed the door, you taught me what truth really is." Her body quivered as she pressed the handkerchief to her chest like a lifeline. Her knees slid from beneath her and she sank down onto the rug, clinging to the fabric and to my legs. "Don't do this. Please don't walk away from me. I'll never forgive myself if you cut me out. Please don't make me live with this." The sound of her weeping filled the apartment, a tide crashing against walls too thin to contain it. Neighbors might have heard, but I no longer cared. This was not humiliation. It was reckoning. I turned slowly from her grasp, prying my hands from her desperate hold, and walked to the kettle. The water had cooled, so I lit the flame again, listening to the soft click as the burner caught. Her voice broke behind me, frantic and pleading. "Mom, say something, please. Just tell me you don't hate me, please, just one word." I set a cup on the counter, lifted the kettle, and poured. The quiet stream of water was my answer. Steam rose, curling through the air like the unspoken truth I could no longer gift in words. Silence is heavier than any sentence, and I let it rest upon her. Her sobs turned guttural, an ache that rattled through her ribs. Still, I kept my back turned, my breath measured, my hands steady as I prepared the tea. This was not vengeance, it was finality, a verdict written not in anger, but in the quiet ink of resolve. She knelt behind me, still clutching the handkerchief, her cries echoing against the small kitchen. I could feel the vibration of her grief through the floorboards, but I did not speak. Silence was the truest language left between us, the only one she had not yet learned to hear. I lifted the cup to my lips, inhaled the jasmine, and sipped. Behind me, my daughter's sobs filled the room. In front of me, the tea's warmth spread through my chest. Between the two was a wall built of silence, and it would not fall. The apartment was quiet again, except for the faint clinking of the cup against its saucer as I set it down. Emily's sobs had ebbed into soft hiccups, the sound of a child who had cried herself dry. She was still on the floor, her head bowed, clutching the handkerchief like a relic of something she could not undo. I thought the night had given me all it could: grief, anger, and silence. But then the door creaked open. Tiny footsteps padded softly across the threshold. My granddaughter, her eyes wide, her small arms already outstretched, ran straight to me. She pressed her little body against my legs and tilted her head back, whispering words so pure they cut deeper than any scream. "I love you, Grandma." For the first time in years, my heart cracked open. Hot tears slid down my cheeks before I could stop them. I bent down slowly, gathering her into my arms. Her warmth was different from Emily's desperation. It was not laced with guilt or fear of losing something. It was simply love, raw and unmeasured. She tucked her head beneath my chin, her breath shallow, as if afraid someone might pull her away. My arms tightened around her. I did not speak, not because I had nothing to say, but because no words could carry the weight of what I felt. The silence that had been my verdict with Emily became something else here. It was not judgment, but sanctuary. The child didn't need explanations. She didn't need promises. She just needed me to hold her. And I did. Emily lifted her face then, her eyes red and swollen, watching us. There was pain there, a flicker of envy too, but also recognition. She saw what I had once given her freely, what she had dismissed, what she had closed the door on the night before. My granddaughter's embrace was a mirror, showing her the shape of what had been lost. The little one whispered again, almost inaudible, "Don't cry, Grandma. You still have me." Her words pierced me, as though she understood more than a child her age should. I kissed the top of her head, letting the salt of my tears wet her hair. My voice trembled when I finally let it out. "You are the reason love still makes sense." Emily's sobs restarted, harsher this time. She pressed her hands against her face. "See, Mom, she loves you. She needs you. Please don't turn your back on us." But her plea was hollow beside the truth reflected in her own daughter's eyes. I did not scold her. I did not accuse her. I did not rehearse the long list of nights I had spent alone, waiting for a call that never came. Instead, I chose silence again, this time filled with the sound of a child's steady breathing against my chest. That silence spoke louder than anger. It said, "Love cannot be demanded, it must be lived." The girl pulled back just enough to place her tiny palm on my cheek. Her fingers were soft, innocent. "Grandma, don't be sad. We can drink tea together, just us." My throat closed around the ache, but I nodded, smiling through my tears. That moment, fleeting as it was, gave me a truth no money, no betrayal, no inheritance could alter. The purest bond was still alive. Emily looked at the floor, her shame swallowing her words. But I saw her flinch as she realized her daughter's love for me had not been taught. It had been instinct, a reflection of something she once knew but let slip away. As I sat there, holding the child, I understood that healing would not come from punishing Emily further. It would not come from forgiveness either, not yet. Healing lived in this small heartbeat against mine, in the way innocence recognized love where adults had forgotten. The tea on the table had cooled, but I did not mind. I had something warmer in my arms, something uncorrupted, unmeasured, and whole. And as I held her, I let the tears flow freely, not for the daughter who had failed me, but for the granddaughter who had reminded me that love, real love, still existed, even in the ruins. The morning after the storm of tears and silence, I stepped outside into the crisp air, carrying only my old handbag and the handkerchief folded neatly inside. My heart was heavy, yet lighter than it had been in years. I walked past the houses on my street, each one holding its own secrets of love or loneliness, until I stopped at a familiar porch. Margaret's house. Margaret had been my neighbor for more than 3 decades. A widow like me, she carried her own scars, though she rarely spoke of them. Every winter, without fail, she baked sweet bread and knocked on my door with a smile that warmed the coldest nights. We had shared coffee and small talk, but life had kept me busy, and I never let myself lean on her kindness. Today, though, I needed to. When she opened the door, her eyes widened. "Clara? Honey, you look like you've carried the weight of the whole world. Come in." Her kitchen smelled like cinnamon and butter. I sat at her table, my hands wrapped around a warm mug she placed before me. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence was different here, gentle, safe. Finally, I said, my voice low, "Margaret, I think I lost my family." She didn't rush to console me. She just reached across the table, resting her wrinkled hand on mine. "Sometimes blood doesn't hold us the way we thought it would, but love, Clara, love can come from unexpected places." Her words unlocked something inside me. I told her about the lottery ticket, about Emily closing the door, about my granddaughter's whispered, "I love you." Margaret listened without judgment, her eyes shimmering as though she had lived a version of it herself. When I finished, she leaned back and nodded slowly. "You know, Clara, there are so many women like us, women who gave everything to their families, only to find themselves discarded. What if we built something together for them? A place, a fund, a way to remind them they're not alone." The thought caught me off guard. For weeks I had been consumed by betrayal and survival, but suddenly Margaret was pointing me towards something larger than my pain. I pictured a circle of older women gathered around tables like this, drinking tea, holding hands, rediscovering worth. Tears rose in my eyes, but this time they were mixed with a new kind of fire. "Yes," I whispered, "a fund, a home, a chance to heal together. The money I kept hidden, it could be the beginning." Margaret squeezed my hand. "See? You thought you lost everything, but maybe you were being guided here all along." We began to dream aloud, voices rising with hope, scholarships for women abandoned in their later years, community dinners where no one sat alone, counseling for those who still carried invisible bruises from words or neglect. With each idea, I felt my chest lift, as though the betrayal had cracked me open just enough for light to enter. I looked around her cozy kitchen, at the curtains she had sewn herself, at the framed photographs of her children and grandchildren who still visited faithfully. For a moment, envy stirred, but it was quickly replaced by gratitude. Margaret's door had always been open, and now, in my darkest season, I realized that was family too. I smiled through my tears and said, "You know, I used to believe family was where you came from, but it's not. Family is the place that always opens its door when you knock." Margaret's eyes softened. "Then, my dear, this house is your family too." We sat in quiet solidarity, sipping tea, the clock ticking steadily in the background. Outside, the day was moving forward, but inside, something new had begun. I was no longer the woman defined by what her daughter had taken. I was the woman who could give again, not to those who demanded it, but to those who truly needed it. The old handkerchief lay folded on the table beside me, its threads frayed but strong. It was no longer a relic of sacrifice alone. It was a symbol of continuity, a thread from my past that could stitch into the future, not for Emily, perhaps, but for others like me. When I left Margaret's house that afternoon, I carried no bitterness, only resolve. My steps were steadier, my back straighter. For the first time since the night Emily shut the door in my face, I felt the quiet certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be. Within 2 weeks, Margaret and I sat across from Harold again, this time not to hide money, but to aim it. We formed a small charitable trust with a plain name, the Open Door Fund, and we promised to keep it quiet. No ribbon cuttings, no headlines, only clean mattresses, steady heat, and leases in names that had been missing. I authorized a modest portion of the winnings. Harold designed guardrails so the fund would outlive my moods or mistakes. I felt lighter signing those papers than any check I had ever cashed. We started where loneliness gathers, in the basement of a church that runs a food pantry. Margaret knew the director. I knew the shame of asking. We brewed coffee and listened. Stories arrived like tidewater. Women who buried husbands and pensions. Women who left houses where kindness failed. Women who slept on nieces' sofas until the welcome soured. We told them the fund would cover deposits, modest rent, and essentials while they rebuilt wages or health. There would be no sermons about gratitude, no hoops. Just doors that opened and stayed open. A retired broker donated time to negotiate leases. A carpenter from the high school shop brought students to install grab bars and patch plaster. The landlord above the old bakery offered 2 apartments if we paid for paint. We matched volunteers with afternoons and budgets with lists. I carried a clipboard, but I also carried soup from my stove, because paperwork does not warm a room the way soup does. On a rainy Saturday, our first 3 residents arrived. Mrs. Alvarez, 76, came with 1 suitcase and a wedding photo. Her hands shook while she smoothed the quilt a church lady had sewn. Nadine, 64, limped slightly from a fall. She pressed a palm to the window and whispered that the street looked safe. Ruth, 81, covered her smile with both hands when she saw the brass number on the door. She had not held a key of her own in 15 years. I placed keys in each palm. The sound of metal against skin was small, but it rang like bells. I said their names the way I wish people would say mine, not quickly, not as an afterthought. Mrs. Alvarez asked whether plants could live on the sill. Nadine asked if the oven worked. Ruth asked nothing, only cried and nodded. In those eyes, I saw the porch of my daughter's house and felt something mend by stitch I could not have made alone. We stocked cabinets with rice, beans, tea, and a jar of honey for good days. Margaret labeled drawers with tidy handwriting. A volunteer electrician checked outlets and tightened a switch that flickered. The bakery sent up a bag of rolls and a cinnamon loaf warm. We ate on folding chairs and passed paper plates like communion. The fund grew its legs quickly. A hairdresser offered free cuts on Tuesdays. A clinic promised sliding scale appointments. A law student drew up simple wills. I kept the handkerchief on my desk during calls, my thumb working its edge while I approved invoices. Its fray reminded me not to confuse efficiency with care. I visited each apartment weekly with a checklist and questions not about rent. Are you sleeping? Do your hips ache on the stairs? One afternoon, Ruth stood in her doorway, back straight as a sapling, and said a sentence I will carry until I cannot carry more. I am not afraid to lay my head down anymore. The words sank into me like rain into ground. Nadine began baking cornbread for the building. Mrs. Alvarez clipped recipes from the free paper and planned a small herb garden for spring. The hallway filled with soft talk, the music of ordinary peace. I will not pretend the work solved everything. Loneliness still visits and grief keeps its own calendar. But each time a key changed hands, I felt my chest loosen. The money could not buy back the love I had lost. It could build a roof for many who had lost theirs. That is the line I wrote atop our ledger and the prayer I murmured locking the office. At night, after meetings ended, I walked home past windows lit amber and thought about family as a verb, not a noun. It looked like bread left at a door, like a ride to a clinic, like someone sitting with you while the kettle comes to a boil. When I reached my apartment, I folded the handkerchief, set it beside the ledger, and thanked rooms that once held silence. Tomorrow there would be more calls, more lists. Tonight there was the soft click of safety settling into place. The morning sun stretched over my new garden, and I stood there with a tin watering can, guiding thin silver streams across marigolds and lavender. The scent of damp soil rose up, the smell of something tended rather than abandoned. For the first time in years, I did not wake to silence that weighed heavy. Instead, I woke to the hum of bees and the creak of the porch where Margaret had helped me hang a swing. The house was modest but mine, Not a shelter, not a borrowed corner, a home. As I bent to pinch off a wilted petal, I heard footsteps on the gravel path. My granddaughter's voice floated before her shape appeared. "Grandma, I brought my book." She was clutching a worn paperback, her braid bouncing behind her. My heart lifted at the sight. Emily had resisted, argued, cried, but in the end she allowed her daughter to come on weekends. Perhaps she sensed what her own fear and greed had cost her. Perhaps she knew that love would travel through the cracks, no matter how she tried to seal them. We sat on the porch swing, side by side, her small shoulder pressing into my arm. She opened the book, and I listened as she read aloud with careful pauses. Her voice stumbled on larger words, and I whispered the sounds until she smiled in triumph. Between chapters, I showed her the herbs sprouting in terracotta pots. She sniffed the basil, wrinkled her nose at the rosemary, and laughed when a butterfly darted past us. That laugh felt like a balm stitched directly into my chest. I thought of the night when her mother told me to go to a shelter, how the word had cut into me like a knife, and now here I was, building not only my own refuge, but many. The fund had grown into apartments full of voices, kitchens full of pots, simmering with meals. Doors were opening every week for women who had been turned away before. I had become, in ways both quiet and radical, the shelter they were told to find elsewhere. What irony! What grace! Inside the house, the walls glowed with new paint. The air smelled of bread cooling on the counter, a gift from Ruth, who now baked weekly. Margaret often visited with her knitting, her steady presence grounding me. We had made a ritual of tea at sunset, when shadows softened and the neighborhood children chased fireflies. Those evenings we spoke less of sorrow and more of beginnings. The silence between us was no longer hollow. It was whole. My granddaughter's laughter echoed through these rooms, chasing away echoes of Emily's cold voice. I did not forget the cruelty of that closed door, but I no longer held it like a wound that bled daily. It had become a scar, teaching me where not to lean. I had learned that sometimes family is chosen in the aftermath of betrayal. Sometimes it is the neighbor who shows up with bread, or the stranger who volunteers to paint. And sometimes it is the child who, uncorrupted by bitterness, still says, "I love you," without condition. That afternoon, after the story was finished, we spread a blanket under the oak tree. She lay back, pointing at clouds, shaping them into castles and dragons. I remembered when Emily was her age, how she once asked me if love could be seen. I had told her love was not visible, but felt in the warmth of a hand. Now, watching my granddaughter's fingers curl into mine, I wondered if perhaps love could indeed be seen, in gardens watered, in doors unlocked, in voices reading stories on porches. The sun lowered, and Margaret waved from her yard, calling us in for supper. My granddaughter jumped up, racing ahead, her braid flying like a banner. I followed slowly, the watering can still in my hand. I paused once more to glance at the flowers. They stood tall, resilient, fed by patient care. I realized I was not so different from them. Once neglected, told to wither, now rooted and blooming again. The quiet was no longer loneliness, it was peace. The house behind me, the garden before me, the laughter inside, these were proofs that I had built something real. I had been pushed toward a shelter, dismissed as a burden. But I became instead the keeper of homes, the bearer of keys. And in that truth, I found a serenity that no betrayal could erase. I have learned to speak plainly and to keep my voice steady. When people ask how things turned out, I tell them this: the ones who stay when you have nothing left are your family. The rest are passers-by. I do not recite it like a slogan. I say it like a compass reading, a direction that keeps you from walking in circles. Emily and I do not trade long conversations. We keep the calls brief and the tone courteous. She drops off my granddaughter on Saturdays and picks her up after supper. Sometimes she lingers on the porch, contrite, searching my face for the door I once kept open. I nod. I do not invite her inside. Boundaries are a language, and I am finally fluent. In the house, I water plants, wipe counters, and keep a book open on the arm of the chair. Margaret brings bread. Ruth leaves cornbread with a sunny note. Mrs. Alvarez clips basil and shares. The open door fund pays rent on time and keeps our promises. We do not make speeches. We make lists, then we make homes. I still carry the handkerchief. It lives in my pocket. I take it out when memories flicker, when a phone call reopens the seam between past and present. My thumb follows the crooked initials, and I remember the cost of love that asked for nothing back. Money cannot refund those nights or buy a second chance at tenderness. It can, however, build a clean, well-lit room where someone else can rest. That is enough. People say justice is loud. Mine is quiet. I did not slam any doors. I simply stopped holding them open for those who would not walk through. I did not shame my daughter in public. I let consequence speak to her in private. If she learns, it will be because life teaches. If she does not, I will grieve, and then I will go on. My hands are needed elsewhere. On Sunday afternoons, my granddaughter and I read under the oak. When the wind lifts her braid, I catch the scent of grass and library paper. She asks questions that untie my chest. Did I have a favorite story as a girl? Did I ever want to be an astronaut? Do flowers sleep at night? I answer honestly, and when she leans against me, the world feels held together by threads that do not snap. At times, I think about the porch where a door once closed, and about the many doors that opened afterward. I see women receiving keys. I hear the click and the breath that follows. I feel the hush that comes when fear loosens its grip. No fanfare, only the music of cabinets closing softly and water running in sinks. Home makes that music. I have forgiven enough to live in peace. Forgiveness is not a pardon. It is the decision to stop rehearsing hurt. I do not erase what happened, and I do not keep wounds fresh. I let them scar. The scar reminds me where to place my weight. It keeps me standing. Tonight, the sky is the color of plums. I brew tea and carry the cup to the table. I place the handkerchief beside it, smoothing the fabric with my palm until it lies flat. Steam rises, and in it I see every version of the woman I have been. Wife, mother, widow, worker, beginner. I am all of them, and I am also this, a keeper of doors. If you have been listening, thank you for sitting with me. If you have lived a version of this story, share it. Would you forgive, or would you keep your silence as I have? Tell me what boundaries saved you. Tell me what kindness found you. The ones who stay when you have nothing left are your family. The rest are passers-by. Before we say goodbye, tell us where you are watching from. Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Leave a comment. We read everyone with gratitude. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not only to hear more stories, but to join a community that believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for your time today. Wherever you are, carry this story, and remember, sometimes the miracle waits. Quietly, open your heart, take care, and meet us next time.